Well, I want to welcome you back. Today we are focusing on the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. In the window behind me, you'll see the window that depicts that sacrament. You see the olive branch, the olives are there, and you see a jug over to the left there of olive oil that is there in the jug. And I want to speak to you a little bit about the history of healing and the sacrament itself. And I want to begin first by restating something I shared in the video on baptism, and that is the olive oil was a common element within the culture around the Middle East. Olive oil was used not only in foods, but also used to anoint people. We think about all the various creams we have today for dry skin, for scalp, for wounds, for burns, and we have a variety of creams that we use to help us when we're ill or have abrasions on our skin, or maybe when our skin is dry or cracked from the heat or from just normal wear and tear on our bodies. And we'll think back in the time of Jesus and the ancient times. Really, the only oil that was available was olive oil. And olives, of course, grew very, very well in that climate. And so the various cultures, the various nationalities, the peoples that lived around the Mediterranean area would use olive oil. Olive oil within the foods, but also olive oil for healing purposes, and also for cleansing and for cleaning. And so oil was a very common practice. And this would have been something that the early Jewish people would have been familiar with, and including Jesus. And Christianity grew out of this culture. And so you can imagine, the practice. People were sick. Maybe they had a burn on their skin. Maybe the skin was dry or cracked, or maybe the skin was irritated in some way. And you can just imagine they would take the olive oil and rub it on the place that is sore or irritated, and they would rub it in. And you can just imagine that, as the early Christians would gather, they would pray for healing, pray for recovery, pray that God would restore the health of that skin. And this was, would have been the practice in the various earliest times, something that would have been common among the Jewish people, as well as among other cultural groups of the time throughout the Mediterranean area. And so the early church came out of this culture using something that everybody was familiar with and understood. But there's also another dimension, and that was the dimension of trust that God hears our prayers, that God heals. And so we see that, in the scriptures, like in the book of James, where it says that if any among you are sick, bring them to the presbyters of the church, let them pray over them and anoint with the oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise them up. And if they be in sin, their sins shall be forgiven. And so, in the book of James, there in the New Testament, we see an understanding of not only of the power of prayer, but also that God heals, and that also God forgives. And we see, in the Gospels, where Jesus' ministry is a ministry of healing. And we see Jesus healing people that are sick and healing a variety of illnesses and injuries. And we see that continued in the book of Acts, where the apostles continued the work of Jesus and continued to that ministry. We find that by the 4th century, Pope Innocent declared that chrism was to be blessed by the bishop, and the bishops and priests would administer the sacraments, and that they would carry out the work of anointing people and healing people. So we saw that the very early practice is something that people would use olive oil and prayer as a natural part of the healing process. Began to be more ritualized and formalized within the church. We see by the 7th century where being the venerable referred to the same practice of the early church of using oils blessed by the bishop, and those oils used by the bishop and the priest to anoint people, to heal people. But there's something that evolved over time. Following the fall of Rome and the disintegration of the Roman Empire, we went through a time of disruption of civilization throughout the Mediterranean world. We see, mass migrations of peoples and movement of tribes. We see a time of sickness and plagues begin to fall upon the people. And so we find that people's understanding of God, their understanding of the world, understanding of self, began to evolve. In the early church, there was a sense of very positive, very hopeful, sense of the world and of God, that the Lord was coming soon. There was not this overwhelming fear of sin and death, but as time went on, and you had plagues, and eventually the plague that hit so much of Europe, the sense that sin and death was God's punishment. We see an evolution begin to take place in people's understanding. Some saw illness and death as maybe even punishment from God. And so we find that the anointing of the sick took on a kind of more of a last rite, if I may use that word, something that was reserved more towards the end of life, and stressing more the forgiveness of sins instead of the healing aspect, and something that would have been very common to use. And so we find that by the around 700 and then evolving into the 1100 to 1200, a movement of the anointing from something common and something that was readily used to something reserved for the dying and for those near death, so that by the 12th century, it was something that was reserved for the very end of life, and it was something that was seen as something rarely used. And so we find that the stress evolved in the sacrament from one of a healing and something that was repeatable and rarely used to something that was reserved for maybe only once or twice towards the end of life, something reserved for as almost as a get out of jail card, get out of hell card, as something that was reserved and focused more on the forgiveness of sins. And so sickness would lead to confession if at all possible. And so we had a phrase where we talked about the last rites. And the last rites wasn't just something reserved to the anointing. It was also seen as confession. It was also seen as communion. So the last rites, confession, anointing, and communion as a final sacrament to prepare somebody for to leave this world. And this practice continued up into the 1900s, but then beginning in 1955, we began to see a new emphasis being brought back to the sacrament. And there began to be a desire by Rome and by the Vatican to try to restore more the healing aspect and the repeatable sense of the sacrament. And so a new emphasis on healing, repeatable sacrament, and then a communal sense as well. And so it wasn't something just with the priest at the bedside of the one who was dying, maybe in a nursing home or in a hospital, but something that would be done within the church on a Sunday morning, where the family and friends would gather and we would pray for them. And so we've seen the sacrament as a sacrament that has evolved over time, something that was a common practice, something that would have been part of the culture, to something that was reserved towards the end of life, and more remedial of sins, and get out of jail free card, to now, once again, a sacrament that is used on a regular basis, encouraged to be used whenever someone is sick, somebody is injured. A sacrament that is communal, so that the whole church may gather together and pray for healing for the person. And so we've seen the sacrament begin to evolve over time. And what we find is that, there's a remedial part that we recognize that the sacrament does forgive sins, but it's also that the sacrament is focused upon healing. And so we don't use the phrase last rites. That is not something we talk about within the church anymore. But for many of our older members, that is the phrase that is still something they understand and something that is addressed. We also encourage people not to wait until they're near death, but to call on us to be able to use the sacrament before one is in the final hours of life. And so if somebody is going in for surgery, to approach a priest and invite family and friends to come together, maybe at the Sunday Mass, to pray for healing. If somebody is going in for a procedure and it's not life-threatening, but they still would like the prayers of the church to encourage them to use the sacrament. And it's a sacrament that can be repeatedly used. And so for chronic illnesses, for chronic pain, it's something that can be used again and again and again to bring comfort, to bring hope, to bring healing. And the sacrament is not only for physical, but it's also the emotional and spiritual side as well. I mean, think about, somebody who's gone through a terrible divorce, and they are devastated. It's been gut-wrenching. They are broken. They're in need of healing. The sacrament can be used in a situation like that. Or let's say, somebody is suffering with depression, anxiety. We can anoint them and pray for God's peace and God's comfort in their time of need. And so the sacrament is our body, soul, and spirit. And so the physical self and the mind, as well as the spiritual side as well. And so it's seen as something that is healing, something that's comforting, something that's reassuring, and something that also restores. And the most important is in the context of communal. That is a community celebration to pray for healing and to pray for God's presence in their time of need. And the sacrament of the anointing of the sick is something that you find within the Catholic tradition. You also will find it in the mainline Protestant churches, as well, though they won't necessarily call it a sacrament, but the laying of hands, the anointing with oil, the use of prayer. You'll find in the Episcopal tradition, the Lutheran tradition, the mainline churches. You'll also find within the Orthodox tradition, the Eastern Christians, they'll refer to this as a sacramental, and so and for prevention of illness as well. Whereas in some of the churches, like Lutheranism, the focus is not so much on the rituals or the sacramentals as such, but on the prayer itself. And so oil is just an external sign that has no power in itself except the power of prayer. And so healing is an important part of our Christian faith. Healing is something we talk about throughout almost all the denominations. We believe in the power of God to heal. We believe in the power of God to forgive. We believe in the power of God to restore what has been broken. And so the power of prayer, and that once again, the sacraments are the external sign of the grace of what God does interiorly for the person. And so the oils themselves are just external signs of the faith and the power of prayer, and and the witness of the community and the gathering of the community in the time of need. And so we do encourage people to come and to seek the sacrament of anointing of the sick. We do encourage them to experience the sacrament whenever they're going through something physical, but also in times of crisis, like during this COVID time. Many people are struggling with anxiety and depression and fear, and so that they could come and to seek the anointing for mental well-being, for mental health. We also pray for spiritual, and so the sacrament is a way of ritualizing. Remember the element of forgiveness, that's a part of it. And so it's a spiritual side to restore our relationship with God and to restore our relationship with the community as a whole. And so the elements of the sacrament is a simple prayer, the anointing of the oil upon the person, and if possible, the laying of hands. And so we'll typically anoint people's hands, we'll anoint their forehead, and sometimes we may actually touch a leg, or maybe an arm, maybe even over the heart if possible. Somebody's doing for heart surgery. And so bringing back some of that early element where the oil was used to anoint whatever physical ailments of that part of the body that was used. And finally, for the sacrament itself, we really encourage people not to wait until the end, but to really call on the church and to seek the church's healing and blessing, and whenever possible to do it within the context of Sunday liturgies or during the week, to come to daily mass, so that the community that is gathered in prayer are able to pray for you and to pray for healing for you. And then finally, in our hospitals, if somebody is had an emergency and ends up in the hospital, almost every hospital has a pastoral care department with chaplains that works at the hospital. And if they're not Catholic, they'll contact the local parish or your own parish to ask that the Catholic priest will come and to anoint. If by chance no priest is available, then we have lay people and deacons that are trained to come to say the prayers, to pray for comfort, for healing people, though they may not have the oils, because the oils reserved to the sacrament itself. But we do have people trained to pray for healing, and we have people that are trained to bring comfort to people in time of need. And we do encourage you to draw on the sacrament and use the sacrament on a frequent basis.